Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. It is the pre-G20 Summit Risk Briefing. It's brought to you by SAPICS in collaboration with the Center for Risk Analysis. My name is Mbongeni Ndlovu. I'm the General Manager of SAPICS, and I'm very honored to be moderating the session this afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us from wherever you are in Africa and beyond. And we really appreciate you setting aside this hour for this discussion. Just before we start, a few housekeeping notes. We will run today's session for about an hour. So we aim to end at about 3 o'clock. After my welcome introduction and context, we'll hand over to the presenters for about 30 minutes. And then we will have hopefully 15 to 20 minutes Q&A where we can bring in the audience in the discussion. You will be muted during the presentation portion, but the chat function is open. So you're welcome to introduce yourself, your name, your organization, what your thoughts are, what questions you have, and we'll make sure to address those during the Q&A. And lastly, a recording and the slide deck will be made available afterwards to all who have registered. So don't worry about trying to do screenshots while we are doing the presentation. Okay, let me go into a bit of the context for this afternoon. We're talking about the G20 summit. As all of you should know by now, South Africa is hosting the G20 summit under the theme Solidarity and Equity and Sustainability. It's officially going to be held next week, Saturday the 22nd and Sunday the 23rd in Johannesburg. However, there have been several pre-engagements and pre-sessions with ministers, diplomats, and other key stakeholders in the G20. The G20's importance, well, it represents 19 of the largest economies in the world, including representatives from the EU and the African Union. It represents 85% of global GDP and an estimated 75% of global trade. So this ostensibly is one of the most important forums for discussion in terms of shaping global trade and the global economy. However, we know that this G20 in particular has borne the brink of several challenges, including the fact that we have many geopolitical tensions in the world, and some of which are characterized by the tension between the US and in particular the US President Donald Trump and South Africa. So whilst we should be celebrating the fact that this is the first G20 on the African continent and celebrating the opportunity that it gives for representativity on the global stage, there are some mild challenges. And I think what we wanted to do as SAPICS, as a professional body for supply chain, is to bring together the community and bring together some experts to give us some geopolitical and economic risk analysis on what's happening on the national and regional agenda. The purpose then of this webinar is threefold. The first is we want to provide you with a clear sense of what is the risk horizon. What are the global and regional drivers that are shaping supply chain disruptions ahead of the G20? The second objective is we want to reflect on what are the risks and opportunities that are connecting to South Africa and Africa's manufacturing, logistics, and trade based on the risks. And then lastly, try to equip you with an actionable mindset of understanding these shifts and planning on how your organization will be able to address these shifts. So today is not just about listening, but it's about thinking ahead. With that context, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests from the Center of Risk Analysis. Firstly, I'm privileged to welcome Chris Hattingh, who's the Executive Director of the CRA. He will be providing an overview of the risk trends. In addition to his role at the CRA, Chris also sits on the executive board of the Global Trade and Innovation Policy Alliance, as well as the Advisory Council for the Initiative of African Trade and Prosperity, and he holds the position of Senior Fellow at the African Liberty Society. He holds a MPhil in Business Ethics degree from University of Stellenbosch, and in his role in CRA, he leads the CRA strategic engagements with clients across South Africa as well as globally. Hi, Chris. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mbongeni. Thank you very much for the platform, for the opportunity. We're looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And he's joined by his colleague, Ofentse Davhie. He's a research associate at the CRA, and he focuses on geopolitical trends and risk, and he basically supports CRA's mission to provide strategic insights. His qualification is that he holds a honors degree in international studies and a BA in humanities with majors in political science and sociology, both from Stellenbosch University. Welcome, Ofentse.
Thank you, Mbongeni, and thank you for the opportunity and looking forward to it.
Thank you. So without further ado then, with that context and purpose set on the objectives, I'd like to hand over to you now, Chris, to begin the journey into this global risk panorama of the G20 and what are its implications. You're welcome to share your presentation and take us through your analysis.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction and setting the scene. Quite a bit for us to cover. So really looking forward to the discussion. We were joking before and that we've updated the slide about 100 times since we started planning it. So I'm glad we can finally get to it today. I'm going to share my screen. If someone can just confirm for me if they can see my screen, and then I will get into it.
Yes, thank you, Chris. We can see it.
Good, thank you. All right. So we're going to look at the new geoeconomic era. What we mean by geoeconomics, that's sort of a combination of geopolitics and economic policy matters. So it's no longer sort of apt or useful to think about geopolitics in and of itself, but also to consider geoeconomic matters. As the US under President Trump has pushed throughout his second administration, the country is engaging in more transactional trade policy and foreign policy. Other countries could now possibly follow suit in this regard, where non-trade matters become part of trade negotiations, become part of where supply chains are invested in, how they are established, supply chains and value chains. We're going to talk about the concept of nearshoring and reshoring and all those kinds of things. And of course, we'll touch on the G20 summit that South Africa is hosting just next week. For those of us in Johannesburg, I hope you are adequately prepared for the traffic jams that are sure to come. So just to give you an idea of the context, we're going to look at the global context, some of our key driving forces, and finally, some key takeaways. We start with the global context. I know every day the headlines are overwhelming, especially this year under the second Trump presidency, second Trump administration. It is part of the strategy for the US at this point in time to really make their allies and enemies and other trading partners more uncertain about how they're going to engage with them. That's part of the negotiating sort of toolkit or toolbox. So the headlines themselves can be overwhelming, but keep in mind just where we sit in terms of broader uncertainty. So it's not just in the South African context, but around the world where things are relatively more uncertain than they have been for a very long time. You do have, for example, a country like China is going to try and couch itself as the protector and stabilizer of global trade, of the rules-based trading order, of the rule of law. Whether countries believe that or not is yet to be seen. So China is going to try and couch itself as the stabilizer, whereas the US is couched as the disruptor. But just to give you an idea of the context, early this year, just how much things were elevated in terms of uncertainty around trade policy, supply chain, when these items were discussed in major newspapers and major journals. This particular index tracks how much that was how much these things were talked about earlier this year. That has dissipated somewhat, sort of post-April, May into the second half of the year. However, when you think about how the US is engaging with countries, how trade deals are being established, I want to invite you to have in mind, all of you will be familiar with the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment. The same thing applies with trade deals with the US. Think about them as Schrodinger's trade deals. They're both alive and dead at the same time. You can think you've got a trade deal with the US, but then President Trump might change his mind based on a news headline or what he thinks that particular country has taken advantage of the US. So for the time being, the new reality for trade around the world, for those of us involved in manufacturing and exporting, importing, logistics, broadly supply chains, it's going to be a new reality of elevated uncertainty. Now, that doesn't mean one just sits back and you don't plan for it, you don't try and prep for it, you don't mitigate for it. But keep in mind, this is now the sort of new reality all around the world. The Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, just to track for you different pressure points on global supply chains. You can see the massive spike during COVID-19 a few years ago, how much of a crunch that impacted on global trade routes and on supply chains, this very big spike in 2020. Then, of course, again into 2022, late 2022, we had the grounding of the Ever Given in the Suez Canal, and that, of course, led to a massive crunch in global supply chains. And then things dissipated again somewhat, and we've seen an elevation again early this year into the rest of 2025 via the policies being implemented by the US, some more cogently or coherently than others. But overall, there is an idea of elevated pressure on supply chains around the world. Now, some regions might be better equipped to deal with this, this new reality. If we look at places like Southeast Asia, relatively, if you look at the European Union, which ostensibly should be better integrated in terms of trade and supply chain, and also just broader trade policy, trade infrastructure, there are elements, areas around the world that should better be able to weather the storm. If you look at South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, you've still got a big backlog of not even sort of maintenance of infrastructure, but many gaps in terms of investing in trade infrastructure. We've got the Africa Free Trade Area, which has been ratified. It is being implemented over time. But to get there is going to require investing in the very boring work of trade and supply chain infrastructure. So your ports, your railways, making sure your border posts are efficient and effective, licensing processes, documentation, getting a handle on crime, of course, in many areas of South Africa and in parts of our neighboring countries, because that impacts negatively on supply chain. So keeping in mind, there's a massive opportunity for sub-Saharan Africa in this moment of elevated global trade uncertainty, that if we can get some of our trade infrastructure points right, there's a massive opportunity in terms of a domestic market in the region, in this sub-Saharan Africa, but also in terms of what we can export and import from other places relative to how maybe Africa has been taken advantage of before this point in time. To just give you an idea of the historical context for US tariffs, those tariff rates are already at their highest in decades. You're going to see fluctuation here and there. South Africa, of course, has 30% at the moment. We might get another 10% because we're part of BRICS. Many of our neighboring countries only have 10 or 15%. So even through putting 30% on South Africa, you can see how the US is trying to isolate us and pressure us to come to the table to negotiate non-trade issues. But also keep in mind, countries like India have 50%, Brazil has 50%. So it's not only South Africa that has drawn the attention, if I can put it very diplomatically, of President Trump. Other countries in BRICS and elsewhere have drawn this attention. Switzerland, I think, had something like a 39% tariff. They're trying to negotiate with the US, and Switzerland, of course, famously neutral in all global conflicts. They might even now be pulled into having to take a particular stance on some US matters that President Trump considers important. Just a quick summary on those US tariff rates to show you where South Africa is relative to some other countries. Of course, South Africa can still export to the US, even with a 30% tariff. It depends on consumers and businesses in the US, whether they still then choose to buy South African goods or not. We have seen quite a bit of resilience in our agricultural sector. Of course, agriculture and automotive, those are the two sectors most exposed to those tariffs because they export the most of all our sectors to the US. But for this point in time, we have seen our citrus exporters perform very well. Some of our other component manufacturers have done well throughout the first 10 or so 10 months of this year. So the effect of the tariffs will still play out. I'm not trying to minimize the impact on the South African economy and certain sectors, and especially in terms of possible job losses. But just keep in mind, it's not only South Africa that is dealing with this new tariff reality. So how tariffs are reshaping global trade. Economic pressure points. So tariffs are being used in both economic and trade terms, but also to address what the US considers non-trade issues. And this will also then shape supply chains. So tariffs could, in a way, act as sanctions, and export bans could also serve as policy tools. It is a form of economic warfare, so trade policy is being used to reward allies and punish rivals. And even here, it's not, one shouldn't fall for thinking of sort of allies and rivals. In the traditional sense, there might be surprises in this regard, countries that the US prefers to partner with. I think the US administration is trying to find countries that it views as having strategic value for the US, and they're going to be much more transactional in how they use tariffs and possibly incentives around reshoring, bringing one's supply chains closer to the US, whether it's in South Africa or in neighboring countries or to the US directly. They're going to be more transactional and just transparent in how they do that. The possible retreat of globalization, this will have an impact in places on supply chains, but don't yet, I think the death of globalization has been oversold and overestimated. Many countries continue to benefit from more globalized trade and integration. We'll see now how this sort of globalized world can weather the shock of a more transactional US. So on supply chain specifically, possible realignment here. So the nearshoring, what we refer to nearshoring and friendshoring, is when supply chains are brought back from places like China, maybe Vietnam, Indonesia, and incentivized either through the carrot or stick approach, brought to the US, to Europe, to places that the US considers closer geographically, because of course there are fewer costs involved in just basic transport. But also maybe there could be an element of here of trying to have more say and more control about where these supply chains are located. The possible most negative impact here to consider is inflation and cost pressures. So it's one thing to want to relocate supply chains, but if you're moving them from places with better labor costs, for example, cheaper labor costs, you've got higher import costs filtering through to consumers. A big risk here for emerging markets like South Africa is because we import so much in terms of manufactured goods and components. If globally supply chains sort of get gummed up or they don't function like they used to before, goods don't move as freely as they did before, one could see price increases. And because we import so much in terms of manufactured goods, that then leads to imported inflation and possibly higher costs for South African businesses and consumers. For emerging markets, very important to manage their debt situation, because if globally things do turn in the worst direction, worst scenario, the global growth picture becomes more tenuous. And that, of course, disproportionately affects emerging markets like South Africa. Moving on from the sort of global context, global picture, just to give you an idea of where South Africa finds itself on the growth front, if we compare us to emerging markets and some other countries, we've averaged 2.22% over the long term. So between 2000 and 2024, since 2012, between 2012 and 2023, South Africa averaged 0.8% growth. Now, usually our population grows at least 1.4, 1.6%. So for the last decade or so, South Africans in real GDP terms, real GDP per capita, have become poorer. So keep in mind, our economy is still in a very weak position. And in that regard, it's again so important for us to get right our trade infrastructure and our trade policy so that we enable our supply chains and manufacturing more broadly to be more resilient and to take advantage of new trade opportunities that are emerging in our country, in countries around us, and indeed on the African continent. One of the big points on the infrastructure side and for supply chains, of course, our port performance. All of you will be familiar with our port performance. The reason why I highlight this is just how probably easy it should be for us to climb up the rankings of the Global Port Container Index, where South African ports are consistently ranked near the bottom. Now, I do have to give a shout out and give credit to Transnet, Transnet Ports, Transnet Rail for the rhetoric changing, the attitude towards the private sector. I don't think one should, assume that the train is pulling out of the station just yet, if I can kill another analogy or another metaphor, another pun. But the rhetoric has shifted in terms of getting private sector investment into the ports, into the railways. We now need to see if this bears real fruit. Are the terms put forward by Transnet, the requests for information, the terms of investment to the private sector, are they attractive enough to get serious participation in our ports, in our railways, and also to just ensure that, for example, we don't just bring in one or two players and it becomes a sort of oligarchy kind of situation where, yes, there's private sector participation, but it's not in a sort of rule of law, transparent kind of way that brings about the best competition, but it's rather done in a way that benefits the politically, those with the necessary political influence. So keep that in mind just over the next year or so. Transnet has reported better volumes over the last 12 months. So again, I want to give them credit for that. Just keep in mind, turning around the Transnet ship in terms of the debt situation is going to still take quite a bit of time for Transnet to manage and repay its debt. On the debt point, I should mention as well, as we are doing this presentation, we've got Minister Godongwana giving his medium-term budget presentation. So it will be interesting to see if there is any support, new support for our state-owned entities such as Transnet. Why I'm talking about the Red Sea and its link to the Suez Canal. You will all recall the impact on global trade and supply chains earlier this year with conflict between Israel and Hamas, but of course also between Israel and Iran. Don't assume that that situation has been normalized and has just will dissipate and won't flare up again. Because so much global trade goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, we've already seen earlier this year when the conflict erupted, we saw a lot of trade coming around the Cape. And that trade has continued. It hasn't moved back to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So even though it's a longer trade route, South Africa's geostrategic positioning, given our geographic location, should not be underestimated. It is much safer to sail around the Cape in terms of just predictability than it is, for example, to try and go further south, just as one example. And also then, if one perhaps assumes the worst case, that conflict flares up again, either in the Middle East or, for example, the Panama Canal is closed due to climate change and drought, the Cape route remains the most attractive. Now, we don't always have the infrastructure to service those ships that come around the Cape, but I think very much that route is going to continue to be vitally important for global trade. That Cape trade route is the 6th busiest in the world. If something happens to the Middle East and Panama Canal, the Cape route becomes the 2nd most important in the world. Despite that intensity declining in the Middle East, the Cape remains well used, and just the point around capacity. Moving on to another point around trade and supply chain infrastructure, Africa's rail network density, and we measure this here kilometers per millions in the population. You can see how well Namibia does in this regard, just if you match capacity or volume amount of rail versus compared to people in terms of servicing pure numbers. However, keep in mind Namibia's geographic dispersion and also quite small population. So just have that caveat in mind. However, South Africa comes in second, on the second best on this particular data point. So there is a lot of rail infrastructure. Yes, a lot of it is not functioning due to copper theft, very basic things in many respects that if we can invest in again, we've got the network to make sure that we take advantage of the infrastructure that is there still in some kind of capacity. If we look at the investment in projects by sector and by region in millions of dollars, just I want to highlight for Africa. You can look at our ports investment here between 2010 and 2022. Roads lagging very far behind if you compare us to South Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe and Central Asia, and also East Asia and the Pacific. So road infrastructure, a massive point to focus on and to try and figure out. Railways as well, how South Africa lags behind Latin America and East Asia and the Pacific. Not so much behind Latin America the Caribbean, but there's a lot of scope here. There's a lot of space for the private sector to get involved. And I will continue to hammer the point around the private sector because many governments, including South Africa's, face very tight fiscal space. They've got very high debt burdens. That means they can't invest in and stimulate infrastructure like they might want to. So a lot of that money, a lot of that funding is going to have to come from the private sector. If you look at the estimated corridor populations in 2020 and 2030 in millions, across the board, across the continent, if you look at some of our key corridors, you can look how much they're going to grow. So from 2020, the bars in red, to 2030, the bars in orange, you've got growth across the board in terms of populations broadly who are linked with, live along, or involved in some kind of way in some of these corridors. There's going to be a lot of growth in the next 10 to 15 years in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. The question is, can we build the infrastructure that will take advantage, that is able to take advantage of that population growth? Where in places like North America, Europe, China, they're dealing with aging populations. They're going to have higher social welfare burdens, whereas Africa is not necessarily going to have that just yet. So we've got some room here to take advantage of the demographic dividend. If you talk about shifting supply chains and investment, I must highlight how China is tapping into Africa's mobility and infrastructure needs. So if you compare year-on-year improvement, year-on-year growth in things like passenger cars, motorcycles, and then number 3 comes construction and machinery. Number 4, we've got trucks and vans, and finally ships. So China, either through the government or through companies or, sort of semi-private companies, are trying to invest a lot into infrastructure in Africa. It depends on African governments, how they deal with that on the right kind of terms. I think there's a lot of scope here for positive investment, but it has to be on a more proactive engagement basis from African governments, especially, where it's not just the case of waiting or allowing for a country like China to come and build infrastructure, and then the individuals, the people who live in those places, in those countries, they're not upskilled, they're not invested in, they don't ultimately own the infrastructure. There is a challenge there, and just in terms of how exactly these projects are done. We compare the US and Chinese markets' relative importance amongst BRICS exports. And again, across the board, you can see how important China is for exports from BRICS countries like Brazil and like South Africa and Russia. However, for India, the US is a more important export market. We've seen the US tapping into this relationship, trying to put pressure on India to not buy Russian oil, for example. But at this point in time, for BRICS countries, in terms of volumes of pure trade, the benefit or the weight is towards China. Now, on the foreign direct investment front, we do get more investment from the US and from Europe, countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, the UK. South Africa gets more investment from those countries in an FDI format. However, we export more to a country like China. Whether we can beneficiate that, whether we can have value add from that export in South Africa, in the South African context, that remains to be seen. We come then to a key issue nowadays in global supply chains, if you talk about supply chains themselves, but also just in terms of how important rare earths, magnets, semiconductors, all of these things are for global trade and for global supply chains. Rare earths, despite the name, they're not that rare. There are lots of them around the world, lots of untapped deposits that need to be utilized wherever possible. However, the country that dominates in pure numbers, as this graph illustrates, is China in terms of production, manufacturing, beneficiation, value add. This is why China has this card to play with the US. I think that's why they could really pressure the US to come back, to roll back some of those very high tariffs. You can see China really has built up almost a chokehold on the production and refining and manufacturing of rare earths. It's one thing to have the deposits, it's another thing to actually get it out of the ground, get it processed, use it in components, use it then in computers and cell phones and motor vehicles and everything else that we use in today's modern global economy. That kind of work requires a lot of electricity, requires serious skill and the right kind of labor force, upskilled labor force. So at this point in time, China is dominating in terms of rare earth production. If you look at rare earths processing and manufacturing by country, if we look at magnets, refining and mining, again, the section in red, China dominates this picture. So at the moment, you would think the incentive is more to make sure that you continue to have access to Chinese supply chains when it comes to rare earths and the manufacturing and refining thereof and that whole process. Especially if you want your economy to have the kind of access to technology, use the kind of technology that this new world, the global world in 2025 requires. If you look at just some high-level overview of some of Africa's critical minerals, just to highlight one or two, in Ethiopia, you've got lots of tantalum. The DRC, of course, has cobalt, copper, tantalum as well. Zambia, very rich copper deposits. Zimbabwe on lithium and platinum group metals. Namibia, lithium, and South Africa, really to our benefit, PGMs, manganese, vanadium, and rare earths. So we've got this card to play. It remains to be seen how exactly we're going to play this card with the US, but also with other trading partners. So that's on the supply chain point, some data points for you to keep in mind on supply chains and global trade. We then come to our key takeaways section, including on the G20. If you compare, and just the big picture, to keep in mind how global trade and global supply chains have shifted. So if you look at how much the US dominated in terms of countries that had greater share with the US in 2000 versus how many now have greater share with China in 2024, you can really see how things have shifted in the last 20, 25 years and probably will continue in this direction. Disruptions to global supply chains are nothing new. I just bring this up to maybe reinforce the point that supply chains are more resilient than we sometimes give them credit for. But just keep in mind how many disruptions there have been to supply chains over the last 10 years or so, never mind the last 5 to 6 years, and how they are proving to be more resilient perhaps than some doom-mongers had feared. Some of the key supply chain risks to keep in mind on the geopolitical front, we've touched on economic instability, just material scarcity and resource risks. The emergence of AI, how exactly it's implemented, whether you have the right processes in place to use AI, or if you're sort of at the mercy of AI and these kinds of processes. Cyber attacks, I must highlight, South Africa is very exposed to cyber attacks. Our cybersecurity for the government, but also for private security, for private sector, is not what it should be. And this is a big one that could be taken advantage of. Extreme weather and climate change, keep in mind how one can mitigate and deal with those risks. And finally, ESG requirements. How are you integrating them to make your business more resilient? Our outlook for supply chains over 2025, 2027. So broadly, the idea is just on your x-axis, if we have conflict that moderates a bit more, and also if you have global economic convergence. So that means countries don't drift apart in terms of trade and supply chains, but they become a bit more integrated. You've got the reformed outlook. That's your more positive scenario. To go further to the sort of opposite end of the spectrum, if global conflict escalates, whether that's through trade wars or direct conflict, if you look at countries like China and Taiwan, for example, or the US in conflict with Venezuela or countries in South America and Latin America, if things become more volatile, but also countries drift apart in terms of more protectionist trade policy, more barriers to trade, then you've got a degraded outlook for supply chains. So that means supply chains then become more exposed and possibly more brittle. Think about going forward, think about geopolitics as man-made uncertainty. So supply and value chains are shifting, not as quickly as some had thought, but they are shifting over time. National security concerns, you're going to hear this a lot. The US is talking about all sorts of things as national security related, and other countries might also follow suit. So tariffs and industrial policy, also energy security, that's a big one to keep in mind. They will define a potential more protectionist age versus a more free trade age that we had before. This reshoring of supply and value chains I have touched on before. That is one thing to be achieved and attained, but it comes with some higher costs. So it's by no means just guaranteed to happen overnight. This possible tilt towards more protectionism. And then we come to some of our key takeaways. So the world is entering a new geopolitical era. It's more might, the rule of man more than the rule of law. Countries like the US are more transactional. The former Indonesian diplomat said that we are geopolitically polygamous. I think this is one point for South Africa maybe to really try and think about and try to take advantage of. Three emerging power blocks, the Americas, the Eurasian core, and the Indo-Pacific democracies. I mentioned the Schrodinger's trade deals. And finally, globalization and multilateral institutions are under more pressure than ever before. They risk fracturing into regional alliances. I can touch on the G20 summit preview. Just very quick overview, as Mbongeni rightly highlighted some of South Africa's priorities. So the group of 20, just to highlight for you some of the countries, yes, the US has said they're not going to attend. The Argentinian president has also not said he's not going to attend, but that comes, if you get between a 20 and a $40 billion bailout from the US, it might put more pressure on you to not attend. So I don't think it's guaranteed that other countries are also going to pull out. Just keep in mind how the US might try and pressure some countries. Some of the key deliverables, we've got enhancing disaster resilience. This one, I think, is a big one, ensuring debt sustainability for low and middle income countries. And of course, South Africa then hands over to the US next year. This very last point that I want to mention, what will determine success? So just because the US is not attending, and I don't want to underestimate it and undersell it, but a lot for the success or not of South Africa's G20 presidency is going to hinge on what comes out of it. What communiques, what agreements, are they along the lines of South Africa's priorities or not? If South Africa knows that the US is going to pursue things on a more finance track next year, does South Africa try and hand that over to talk about trade and investment and finance? That, to me, is going to determine whether it's been a successful presidency. It's not necessarily if the US attends or not, because the US was always going to be a disruptor at this particular summit. So let's see how South Africa can play that game. Very last slide here for you, just to summarize where South Africa finds itself. I'm going to focus on the very first bullet point. So our economy shows a pulse, but lacks strength for robust growth. It's constrained by crime, infrastructure issues, and policy barriers. These things are not unsolvable. They're not to be thought of as impossible. I've taken quite a few trips this year, including to Washington twice. A lot of the perception and sentiment of South Africa remains positive, but they ask questions about, are you guys getting a handle on crime? Are you getting your roads and your ports up to speed? We want to invest. And then the very last bullet point here for you, what is the most dangerous phrase in leadership? Unfortunately, I can't unmute everyone, so don't all shout at once, but I'll give you the answer anyway. I didn't see it coming. So there's lots of data for you here. I know there's lots of trends. The headlines get frustrating sometimes, but try and plan for the long term as well as you can. South Africa has lots to its benefit. Yes, we have serious risks to mitigate, but in this new moment of elevated global trade uncertainty, if we get some of the basics right, our trade and supply chain space should very much be able to take advantage over the next decade. I'm going to wrap up on that note. Thank you all very much for your time, your attention. I couldn't see anyone's faces, so if you were raising your eyebrows, if you were snorting with derision, I couldn't see that, so I'm going to say it went very well. Look forward to your questions and discussion points. Mbongeni, back to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a very comprehensive and insightful presentation, really giving us a good sense of where we are globally, what the challenges are, what some of the potential opportunities are for South Africa and the continent, and giving us some insights into what the potential outcomes may be of the G20. I'd like at this stage to hand over or to move over, sorry, to our Q&A segment. Colleagues online, this is really the opportunity for you to also engage with Chris and Ofentse, our panelists. You're welcome to raise your hand virtually to draw attention to the fact that you would like to make a comment or question, and we'll then bring you into the conversation. In the meantime, Ofentse, I want you to have an opportunity to comment. Do you have any reflection on what are some of our greatest vulnerabilities? You worked with Chris on the presentation. Of course, maybe what surprised you from that, or something that stood out for you that you'd like to comment on?
Thanks, Mbongeni. A comment I'd like to raise is that in terms of South Africa's foreign policy team, in response to the uncertainties that come from the US, is that the foreign policy team is doing its job, and mainly it's because it's been assisted by other countries that are facing the exact same risks. So the objective for every country is diversification. We've seen Ramaphosa and his cabinet all over the world, really in Europe and Asia, with his cabinet trying to strike any kinds of deals in hopes to diversify exports. So the whole world is currently on the same page. The only big hindrance that South Africa is facing, despite it being the biggest investment attractor in the continent, is the domestic issues that we're failing on, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of structural reforms. Those are the domestic issues going hand in hand with the foreign policy initiatives. And if those don't align, then that is the greatest risk to our resilience. But in terms of the foreign policy, all the boxes are being ticked as we can see from now.
Thank you very much, Ofentse. Yeah, touching on a very important point about the market opportunities, the fact that there is an opportunity now to diversify into other markets. There is an opportunity to create optionality in terms of servicing of different markets based on what's currently happening, but reassuring us also that we're trying our best. Trump, as I think Chris said, one of its tactics is to keep everyone on their toes and to not be predictable. And so in that kind of environment, your normal diplomatic channels and normal diplomatic protocols, I guess, come under strain, because how do you deal with an uncertain variable like that? Chris, you come in.
Sorry, I just had to add, and I'd be remiss in doing my analyst work. Just on your point there about exploring and building alternative export markets, I think you're already seeing, I mean, the Department of Agriculture has done well in this regard. I think there are one or two other departments that are really trying to do is, you've seen lots of support for South Africa on the trade front from the EU. Throughout this year, they've talked about South Africa in very pointed terms. I think the EU ambassador earlier this year referred to South Africa as a reliable and predictable trading partner. Don't underestimate like how countries view South Africa in that regard. We need to convince them to put more money into it. But just on the risk front, those alternative export markets, if the US maintains relatively high tariffs on China, those Chinese exports, I mean, consumer goods, manufactured goods, they probably are going to be under pressure to head to other markets, including South Africa. So, I mean, all of us will have seen the influx of Chinese automotive vehicles, other manufactured goods. Try and, where one can, prepare for the possible more coming down the line, whether it's in automotive or elsewhere. Those goods, if they can't go to the US due to high tariffs, if they're disincentivized from going to the EU, they might come to places like South Africa, Latin America, etc. So, I mean, competition, it can be both good and bad, but just keep in mind, I think that kind of thing could develop over the next 1 to 3 years from China towards South Africa.
Great. I think our colleagues are shy in the chat here, but in the meantime, I'd like to also raise one of the questions that I saw from your presentation. Very interesting that the Cape route, Chris, is the second most important route, and the fact that that routing becomes so critical if there are challenges on the Red Sea. Do you think we're taking enough advantage in terms of investing in infrastructure for that route? What are your thoughts about us being able to really make sure that actually we are a source of resilience for global disruption?
I think, yeah, to give a bit of a punt to Transnet again, like you've seen the focus on investing in in some equipment. So at Cape Town Harbour, for example, more cranes being acquired, Durban terminal, which in volume terms, no port on the continent can match it, despite investments in other countries on the continent, by other countries on the continent. However, if you look at port capacity, I don't think we're operating near where we should in terms of servicing the containers, the ships that come around the Cape route, whether those goods are meant for South Africa and our neighboring countries or not, whether the destinations are elsewhere. There we're going to see possibly investment in places like Richards Bay and elsewhere, which could help take some of the strain off of Cape Town and Durban and give us more scope for servicing yet more. But at the moment, I think Transnet's focus has been on, and the current board, headed by Michelle Phillips, CEO Michelle Phillips, the focus has been on just sort of steadying things a bit and getting new equipment where you can, and not yet going for the bigger sort of infrastructure investments kind of thing. Hopefully it's a positive snowball effect, so the upward virtuous cycle, and if you get some of the basics on the maintenance side right, you then have more breathing room to invest in real new capacity, but not just yet. I don't think we're servicing that traffic as well as we could be doing. You're on mute.
Thanks, Chris. There's a question in the chat about whether the US actually may be going to impose more challenges in the period while Trump, I guess, is still the president. Maybe I would also add a dimension to that, specifically focusing on the G20. There have been some commentators that have been saying the US may boycott, ostensibly the G20, but still invite their ambassadors to come in and basically veto any of the decisions in order to undermine, the G20. So, maybe commenting on, the potential that actually it's gonna be worse. We still haven't seen the end of these challenges, both from a diplomacy perspective and from an export perspective.
I think on the export point, like you have seen, so some sectors and some exports will, I think one can say, are going to be fine. And when I say fine, I mean things like critical minerals and mining exports, where there are already exemption on those. Those are, for the time being, the US hasn't built the alternative supply routes, supply chains, value chains. For some critical minerals, they import a lot in that regard. There's more that they could take advantage of domestically in the continental United States, but not yet, and they're reliant on South Africa for that. And it's interesting, South Africa, because we want to support multilateralism, multilateral institutions, we don't want to use these cards in our deck in a more transactional way, where maybe this moment does require that with a country that is itself being more transactional. So there is a question about sort of foreign policy and engagement, difficult to navigate. So on that point, I think some sectors, some exports will be fine. Others, yes, you're going to see them trying to leverage that pressure point, maybe where they see it has a real impact on employment, or in certain provinces or certain communities, maybe then they'll say, if you don't come to the table, we're going to ratchet up higher tariffs. And they can always continue increasing tariffs. Like, it's not, I think the Chinese tariffs went to 150% maybe at some point. So it's not like they're averse to that. And just on the sort of diplomacy escalation side, the biggest, I guess, piece of legislation, and maybe Ofentse could also speak a bit about this, we've got the US South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act that is wending its way through Congress and might end up on President Trump's desk. That in and of itself contains, if the administration views the relationship as being anti-US national security, US interests, which is again a broad term, that could lead to something like targeted sanctions on ANC and government individuals. Then you look at, travel bans, cutting off of financial flows, all that sort of thing. But keep in mind, even though the US is being more robust, again, if I can be diplomatic in its engagements, it views a country, I know it doesn't feel like this, but given all the attention, it views South Africa as very geostrategically important in terms of the conflict with China. So it's going to want to still be open to securing some kind of deal going forward. And President Trump, for everything we can all say about him, he does love a deal. He loves the optics. And he is still more pragmatic than some of his partners. Yes, he has seized on some of these more political talking points, so-called, white genocide, all this stuff. But he is more pragmatic and is looking for deals where possible. Whereas his colleagues, if we think at the end of his term, someone like Vice President Vance or Marco Rubio, they're arguably more ideological. So South Africa, I think, still enjoys a moment of more pragmatism in the White House, and we need to take advantage of that. We might need to give him, I don't know, Japan gave him a gold-plated golf ball. So we need to also just here and there play some clever sort of optics, and then try and from that still de-risk from the US, build alternative markets, but also still tap into US exports where we can.
Thanks.
And if I could,
Thanks for that. You're reminding me, we have our SAPICS Golf Day next week, Friday, and perhaps it was a missed opportunity. We should have just invited him for the golf day, and then he would have stayed over for the G20. Ofentse on the US Bilateral Review Act.
Yeah, if I could also add on that, Switzerland also gifted Trump a Rolex and some nice Swiss watches, and the 39% tariff may be going down quite soon. So it's really a this for that kind of diplomacy. But also speaking on to first touch on the US attempting to boycott the G20, we can also analyze the G20 as not only an abstract grouping, but it's also practically it's the leaders of the 20 biggest economies coming into one room to discuss an agenda. So whether the US is involved or not, these people are going to speak of agendas not only for the G20, but also for their own bilateral agenda. Like Chris mentioned earlier, the EU and South Africa, they have a good standing relation. So whether the US agrees on the overall G20 agenda or not, whatever outcome comes out of that, South Africa, along with the 18 other countries, can go on with whatever the agenda has been agreed on. And in terms of the US-SA relations, the bill in Congress, there are currently two bills in Congress, but they are not targeting South Africa as a whole. They're just targeting specific individuals, specific politicians. And speaking on Congress as well, the tariffs, the US will struggle to impose more barriers onto South Africa's exports to the US. Currently, the tariffs are being discussed in the US Supreme Court, and it's looking as if the president's powers are going to be limited by Congress. The only way to truly impose tariffs are in Congress, and that takes a bit longer. It takes a bit of procedural discipline. So there's still uncertainty. I can't say for sure that there won't be an increase in tariffs, but just as the normal world of tariffs before the Trump administration, we're never going to go back to that. Will there be more tariffs? We don't know yet.
It's some mediating factors that may limit the more extremes that we've seen in the beginning. No, excellent. Colleagues, thank you so much. We will now draw our session to a close. I just want to summarize by saying it's been a very insightful presentation, both reflecting on the G20 and the US and South Africa dynamics, but really giving us some key insights and opportunities from a global perspective. Mentioned among them the potential market diversification, the potential for more participation of the private sector in the supply chain, South African supply chain sector, and the fact that we should be involved in that, or our members should be involved in that. The Cape routing optionalities, African trade routes and African trade, the African trade agreements, and the opportunities around critical minerals and rare earth minerals. So some key opportunities that one should be putting on their agenda for next year in terms of your strategy as an organization. So just to thank my two panelists, Chris Hattingh and Ofentse from the CRA. We hope through the feedback that we're going to get from this session, we can structure more talks around different topics that are of interest to the members. and perhaps even in future evolve into something more regular in terms of risk analysis. So please give us that feedback from the audience so that we can shape more of these discussions and insights going forward. And I'd also like to thank everyone who helped to organize this session, especially our SAPICS team. A reminder that the link and slides will be shared with you after the session, and please forward those to the teams as well. I really appreciated Chris's ending point about the fact that one of the most dangerous things to say in leadership is that I didn't see it coming. And I think part of what he's saying there is, as leaders now, we should be anticipating change, positioning ourselves for the future, and really thinking about building agile supply chains in this new era of disruption. So thank you very much. This is the final webinar for the year, but we look forward to hosting you again early next year to discuss various topics that suit our members. Have a great afternoon, and thank you. Goodbye.